let's jump back again to the people leading this charge right now. You know, we mentioned Max Baucus and Dave Camp, the two committee chairmen on the Hill who are really at the center of all this. Is that enough? Do we have the leaders that we need right now to make tax reform happen?
I don't think that we do have the leaders now to make tax reform happen. And the thing is, the reason is we're missing one big leader, and that is President Reagan isn't in the White House, and President Obama is not interested in tax reform in a way necessary to push it through a divided Congress. Without White House leadership, it is very difficult to keep the momentum moving really on any legislative project, but tax reform in particular, where there are so many winners and losers, such a dichotomy between the two sides, you need the White House there to broker some kind of a deal, to use the bully pulpit to push some kind of a compromise. And Obama is not interested enough in tax reform and probably not interested enough in compromise, because I think Obama's position on the spectrum is probably very far into the Democratic position of higher revenues, and that isn't going to be, he's not going to be able to force a compromise operating from that position. Also, very little leadership from the Treasury Department. We were promised a white paper on corporate tax reform that seems to have been scuttled. Treasury has not moved the ball on this issue at all. And as everybody who is familiar with 1986 knows, Treasury was a big player. Their studies, their papers moved the ball on tax reform significantly. And with all due respect to Dave Camp and Max Baucus, they aren't Rostenkowski. They don't have... Rostenkowski had influence across both sides of the aisle. Dave Camp, it's not clear that he has any Democratic support. And actually, it's not that clear that he has any Republican support. So he's sort of operating on his own. Definitely well-intentioned, definitely sincere in his desire for tax reform. Not clear that he has the political clout or the legislative skill to get it done. What are the differences between now and 1986? But besides presidential leadership, what are we missing?
Well, you know, one of the really important things, and it's wonky in the extreme, but that in 1986 we had some very specific plans out there. The Treasury Department in particular had produced a plan for sweeping tax reform. They had laid it out there in all its ugly details, and that's ugly because it mobilizes those constituencies against certain provisions, certain aspects of the reform. But they had put it out there and they said, here's what we think tax reform should look like. That gave Congress something to work with. That gave everyone something to react to. And you need that sort of specificity to move the discussion forward, because until then it's all just, I'm all in favor of lower rates and we're going to pay for it by closing loopholes. And we can say that all day, every day, year after year, and it gets us not 1 inch closer to actual tax reform. So until the rubber really hits the road, until these guys actually put these controversial details down on paper, we're not going anywhere. So we have a president who's not really doing much of anything to advance the ball. We have two great, well-meaning chairmen of the tax writing committees on the Hill who are trying very hard to do it, but who don't necessarily have any support from their own parties to do it. Given that sort of grim picture, is it even worth talking about this anymore? I mean,
I think it's definitely worth talking about it, because the House Ways and Means Chair and the Senate Finance Committee Chair have the important power of bringing bills before their committee. And if they actually do a markup of a tax reform bill in the fall, it will be something worth discussing, even if it has no chance of even being reported out of committee. Just putting something on paper and letting the parties debate it can make progress in the tax reform area. Not progress for 2013, probably not progress for 2014, but having something out there can move the ball a little bit. I think it is worth discussing as long as the chairmen remain interested in pushing it. I don't think it's worth discussing in a vacuum, given the political situation in Congress, but Baucus and Camp have important positions. They have the ability to actually put tax reform bills on the table. This is something the average congressman cannot do. It's not even something really the White House can do. And I think that means it is worth discussing. Is it worth discussing as a realistic legislative outcome? Probably not.
so we're playing a long game, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you think it'll happen in the near future?
I think tax reform might happen at some point, but not in the near future. Not this year, not next year. I would be waiting for new elections to sort of recast the political landscape, because I think that the country is really divided right now. And until we resolve broader questions about how we want to manage the federal budget, what we think of fiscal policy, how the economy should be working, and what government's role should be in it, these are sort of gigantic questions. but the parties are deeply, deeply divided from one another over them. And I think that tax reform just can't happen in that atmosphere. Got any advice for Congress?
I think in terms of what Congress needs to do is it needs to do just what the chairman have promised. Propose legislation, mark up a bill in committee, talk about the pay-fors, because that has not been discussed. Be specific. Specific proposals have a lot more chance of surviving in the future than broad principles. And I know that doesn't make much sense, but it's true. Pay-fors have a way of creeping into legislation in a way that a massive tax reform bill does not have a way of sneaking into law. So that's my advice to Congress. Like, drop the discussions of 25% rates. Talk more about how you can pay for any rate cut. Talk more about what you can do to stop profit shifting. Talk more about the dichotomy between corporate and partnership tax, which very technical, but it needs to be discussed.
So think small. That's
think
your
small,
advice.
exactly. Think details. Think things that might come back up regardless of who's in control of the House or the Senate in the future. In terms of the White House, do something. I mean, if Obama wants to be involved in tax reform, he has to actually do it. Tell Treasury to release a white paper on corporate tax reform. Tell Treasury to create one if it hasn't done so, although I think most people think that it has, and it's just being held back. The White House has to be involved. It has to be engaged. But on the other hand, if Obama isn't interested in tax reform, you know, maybe my advice is focus on IRS and NSA scandals and preserve your party's majority in the Senate next year.
I mean, it sounds to me like what you're suggesting is good policy, but not great politics. Probably.
Definitely not good politics.